Well, thank you so much for that introduction. The title of my talk is Ubiquitous Learning, by which we really mean that we can envision a future in which learning is possible anywhere, anytime. But I'm going to start with what I think is the framework for this. And in the 1970s, a professor at UC Berkeley, Martin Troe, developed this idea that there was a pathway that every country was going to follow sooner or later. And it starts with the development of elite institutions for the top few percent of students, institutions whose job it is to recreate the dominant class. But soon enough, after the Second World War, with the advent of industrial economies, the economic recoveries, we soon began to need much more than just educating a few people to assume the roles of leadership in a given country. Instead, we needed mass institutions of higher education, ones in which we could develop the new managers, the engineers, the technical staff that was needed for large-scale industrial production. And so we saw the development of mass institutions of higher education. And he also, from the standpoint of being a professor in California, he also envisioned a transition towards universal higher education. Why California? Because he was really looking at the three-part system that we had. The University of California for the top students in the state, the California State University, a four-year institution for the top 25%, and then for everybody who wanted an education, for the first time in history, the California community colleges existed in every part of the state, and you could get in a car or a bus and get to a nearby campus and receive the first 2 years of education, after which you could transfer to one of the four-year institutions. So he was part of that process in California. He saw that happening, but he began to see that happening in country after country and made this as a central prediction that as institutions of higher education expanded, as ever-increasing numbers of families had access to send their children to a university or a college, that you would see a transformation in what a university was at the same time. That the old institutions, the old elite institutions, would give way to new purposes. So, for example, for the community colleges, the idea of educational standards was giving way to the notion that they were adding a value in any given program to that student. So in any case, this is the beginning of somebody who is seeing these developments happen well before the internet. So then I'm going to fast forward, and we go to 2000. And then president of MIT, Charles Vest, asked the faculty committee, what should the university do? Now that there's the internet, what should we do? And you can see here the normal way that a university was seen, that had a monopoly on content, that is a place where students go for experiences, and that it provides certification. So we asked the faculty, what should we do? And the faculty in 2000 answered open courseware. They made up the term. It didn't exist. But the notion was, with the internet, it cost nothing to publish university educational materials for the entire world. So as before, when we used to have print books, the cost would have been prohibitive. But with the internet, course materials could become universally available. So I'm going to fast forward again and give an example from my university. So open education, since those early days at MIT in 2000, has really taken great leaps forward. You can really say that there are publicly available materials in almost every content area that a university offers, and that the ability to reach content is now, in actual fact, something that is not only true for Asia, for North America, for Europe, but also for Africa, for Latin America. And so new projects are beginning to take shape. And so the University of California, Irvine, UCI, decided to put out publicly and freely its chemistry videos. So all of a sudden, when you download one of these videos from YouTube, you're not breaking any laws. It's not a music video. And you can actually get almost every course we offer at an undergraduate level and 3 graduate courses as well. And I'm going to go back to this in a second because we realize that just publishing videos, even though it's now extensive, it's our curriculum, it's general chemistry, organic chemistry, physical chemistry. Even though that's wonderful, it's not enough. And I want to go back to this point in a few minutes. Going back to the general issue, content is now free. And that provides the opportunity to have a content strategy for your company, for your university, for the benefit of the world, for the benefit of your employees, to have, for the first time, a real content strategy. And I'm going to give some examples of this. Even in, for example, corporate training, you can standardize and lower the cost of training by using high-quality, open materials that are available in areas that most businesses use, project management. I could name a number of areas. But also, corporations are beginning to take advantage of these open content pathways to offer different ways of getting certified. So in Brazil, as an example, Fundação Getúlio Vargas, which is one of the elite institutions in Brazil, the top producer of the top-ranked MBA, the top-ranked economics department, the top-ranked law school, they began offering open courses and a paper certification for them a number of years ago, well before the MOOCs. So approximately 2 million Brazilians have received these paper certificates from them, certificates of participation. And what we see already is that in Brazil, companies have begun to accept these paper certificates, even though they're not even showing what learning took place yet. It's just a paper certificate for advances in careers, for salaries, and so forth. So we see that. But also we can see that open content provides an opportunity to have a baseline instructional quality, particularly in countries where the quality of education varies a lot, varies from school to school, from professor to professor, from teacher to teacher. To be able to establish a baseline instructional quality through open education is one of the clear content strategies that people are using. I'm not going to go through all of these, just to say that you can see that content itself has become, the real technology behind it, the real digital technology, is the internet. It's the internet as a form of communication. It's the internet as a means of distribution. And I think all universities are now undergoing a digital transition. So think about your universities and say outside the lecture hall, when we're in a room like this, and there's a professor on the stage, but outside of it, what are you doing? Well, you're operating in a learning management system, you're communicating with the professor via email, you're using homework software. Everything becomes digital outside of that very immediate face-to-face classroom. And so this is a big issue for all universities. In fact, as I've traveled, and I'm the past president of the Open Education Consortium, and I've had the opportunity to travel to every region of the world and discuss with hundreds of universities, everybody begins to ask, the same question. Now that we have the internet, and now that we're in a digital transition, what should we do? So, of course, people are creating platforms. And the platforms have a lot of different purposes. There are platforms that include content repositories, communications vehicles. They integrate external tools. They authenticate users to make sure who's actually participating, and so forth. So on the one hand, these are important digital technologies. Platforms are also your prison. And why do I say that? It's because people invest so much that they get trapped by the platform itself. And the education, what's possible with education, and I think some of the speakers who follow me are going to be talking about this more than I can, is that as things change very, very rapidly, the platforms can change very rapidly. Even we see this with the largest MOOC providers, that they have trouble keeping up with what they think they should be doing. They have trouble adapting their platforms. The original design decisions that went into their platforms now are things they wish they hadn't done. And so for all of us who are prisoners of these technologies, we're limited by what they permit. We, of course, have two different, as any good prisoner has, two options. We can stay in jail, or we can break out of jail. Now, with breaking out of jail isn't so simple, because maybe you get away and you find your own freedom, but maybe also you just get arrested and you go back to jail. But this is essentially what we all find ourselves in with digital technologies, is we get to this prisoner's dilemma. So the design of systems that are adaptable, that have lightweight integrations, becomes absolutely important for the future of learning. Now, there's a series of learning technologies that come out of the cognitive sciences. Adaptive learning, you may have heard the phrase. So the adaptive learning is what happens when you, what it should do if it's working well is you remember when you fell asleep in 6th grade, is it should go and find that point and teach it to you because you never learned it the first time. And so that's what adaptive learning does, is finds your gaps in knowledge and actually goes back and teaches you those things and builds back up, particularly for students who have poor preparation in mathematics, as well as other areas. Adaptive learning is an important tool, one of the key ones that we have. But also intelligent tutoring is becoming much more interesting. There were a series of studies that were done 20 years ago that said that effectively, intelligent tutors can never do as well as human beings. And that makes actually all of us feel good. But the problem with it is actually it's no longer really true, that it was both the difficulties in the intelligent tutoring products as well as the fact that they're so much more sophisticated now that a good intelligent tutoring product can do as well as a good tutor. But that's actually very good, because it means something about scaling learning. One of my colleagues at Carnegie Mellon, Norman Beer, the director of the Simon Initiative there, they're releasing a series of tools, and they're releasing them as open source. But he did a study of his platform and found that it was 6 times more effective than MOOCs. And they use adaptive learning, they use intelligent tutoring. But what they've done is they have an open learning initiative, and they've used all the data from all the students that are taking these courses, and they make it freely available to anybody, to constantly improve the courses and constantly improve the services provided to the learner. And this notion that kind of approach, what he said is, he said about the MOOCs, He said, they're scaling teaching. We should be scaling learning. And that's a different focus. So also, of course, we have now dashboard technologies that give feedback to students, that understand when they're in danger of dropping out, failing a subject, offer supplemental assistance. And we have a whole area now called learning sciences, which is the intersection of cognitive sciences and learning technologies. So, pedagogy. If you look at the MOOCs, and how many of you have taken a MOOC? Raise your hand if you've taken a MOOC. There's a lot of hands going up. Great. So they've done something very good, which is the frequent quizzing effect that they have in MOOCs actually is proven to be very effective in terms of reinforcing learning. But if you look at this, this slide, you'll see that you have the video, then you stop and you take a quiz. You have a video, then you stop, you take a quiz, and so forth. It goes like that. It's not actually the best pedagogy in the world, even though they've incorporated frequent quizzing as a mechanism. And so we have to begin to think, what is the pedagogy that's going to be associated with the learning technologies that we are building? So this is what I see as a big difference. So we can sit in the lecture hall. We have limits of attention. I hope I'm a decent speaker, but some of you may not have slept well last night, and you may find your eyes beginning to shut. But if you look at the people in the top right corner, they seem very engaged with each other. And there's a lot of research that shows that when professors are teaching, they've forgotten what it's like to be a student. What they understand, well, for example, my father was a professor of mathematics. And so he would try to teach me math. And I would say, I don't understand. And he'd say, what do you mean you don't understand? It's right there before your eyes. But my brother thought I was an idiot. And he would really speak slowly to me and clearly and carefully and go over things again and again until I understood. Professors have that little bit of myopia that they've forgotten what it's like not to understand some point, not to be able to get over a hurdle in learning. But students who are taking the same class or have just taken the class the semester before remember what was hard about it. And they remember how they learned to understand that concept. And they can relay it to other students better. So this is my idea of how you might think about scale. What if we could build systems at scale, but in which each of those nodes at the bottom are small groups? What if we can recapture with scale the ability to have intimacy in learning? Peer learning is evidence-based. The U.S. Department of Education, basically referring to active learning, peer learning, said this is scientifically proven. So we see now a large-scale adoption of peer learning in areas like the STEM subjects. And that's ultimately what we want. We want to be able to learn in groups of human beings. Going back to my example of open chemistry, we're now working on a prototype of a peer learning application that will take 2,000, 3,000 topics in chemistry for which we have 6-minute or 8-minute video explanations, combine it with open educational resources, textbooks in general chemistry and organic chemistry, and then as well offer practice problems and a whiteboard environment in which people can work together. Now, this is a prototype. We don't have it tested yet. But the notion will be that if we can make this peer environment easier than going to the library with your friends, we will succeed with this. And that would open up a whole new world. As we mentioned, the internet is the vehicle for universality. If we can have peers form to learn chemistry together in one university, we may also be able to do it throughout the entire world, where all of you, as you sit through your general chemistry classes, should know there are people in every other country taking the same class. Yes, taught a little bit differently, but fundamentally general chemistry hasn't changed in 50 years. So the outcome we want from this is to have those technologies that allow us to work with each other to learn the things that we need to learn, whether we're in a corporate setting, whether we're in a university setting, and to make the whole world our classroom. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I realize it's now a half hour later. You're probably a half hour more tired. So part of my task here is to keep you engaged, and engagement, in fact, is one of the key terms that we've heard through the day in various ways as being a critical prerequisite, really, to the other important theme, which is lifelong learning. So with that as a context, I want to talk a little bit about my experience and the experience of the organization I was until recently associated with Institiutoo브플레이. And so my speech here is called Rise of the Gamers. It's about really the rise of digital youth culture, which is heavily involved with games, and what we really can learn from games, as well as from digital media, in how we might craft learning in the future. So I'll start actually with a story about myself and how I got involved with this. I was working in book publishing in 1983, and we got an early PC, and we got some software for that PC, including a flight simulator. This is what graphics looked like in 1983. That actually is the runway at JFK. And I started fiddling around with it, just playing around with it, and weeks went by and months went by, and pretty soon I was able to fly all around New York and up to Massachusetts. And one day, my uncle, who's a small private pilot, mentioned to me that he was going flying one afternoon, and did I just want to come along as a passenger? And I said, sure. So I went out in the airport, and I got in the plane, and I suddenly realized that this instrument panel was the same one that was on his plane. So I told him that, and he said, fine, you fly us to Connecticut. So I did. Imagine my surprise. I had no idea I was actually learning how to fly a real plane, to understand the instrumentation, the systems that were involved, the complexity. And yet I had taken no courses. Well, this got me thinking, or more than thinking, really feeling. This was something new. And I really decided at that point to change my career and get more involved with games. Not just from an entertainment perspective, but from this sort of personal development learning perspective. And I went to an early online startup, this is before the commercial internet, in the United States called Prodigy, well-funded by large corporate backers, IBM, Sears, and CBS, the media company. And I was in charge of games. I felt like a kid in a candy shop until my parents, the bosses, said I really couldn't do the things I wanted to do. They didn't understand it very much. And I had to think, how am I going to do what I want to do? Games are the most popular activity in the consumer market in software. We need to do something there. And so I thought, my management understands business. I'll do a business game. And so I licensed a simulation from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business that they use to train their MBAs, and I built a multiplayer business simulator in 1988, which allowed anyone for free to go on and become CEO of a company in one of 5 different industries and compete against 5 other people, so there'd be thousands and thousands of parallel games. I knew nothing about balance sheets and all of these things. I had been a book editor, then I was interested in game design, and one day the CEO of Prodigy came down. He wanted to play, and so I said, okay, I'll play against you, and I beat him. So there were only several conclusions you could draw from this. One was he really wasn't very good at business, which was not the case. The other was that the simulation wasn't good, but that wasn't the case because this was training the top MBAs in the United States. So the conclusion I came to was I had actually learned something by playing a game without realizing it. So this is a narrative. It's a little bit of a textbook here. Let's review chapters 1 and 2. What did I learn that got me started in this and that will now lead on a larger path? One is, what games represent is not about the content. It's really about the experience and the learning that happens around that. And really key is being able to control the pace of your own learning, the paths that you go through with it, and where you do it. And in the 1980s, of course, it was a desktop, and now it could be anywhere, anywhere in the world at any time. The other piece has to do with motivation. No one does anything on their own time unless they want to. And there's something about the nature of how games are structured as creative works that creates motivation and creates engagement. Oftentimes, people say, oh, games, they're frivolous, they're fun, but they're actually hard. You lose games more than you win them, and in that comes the engagement to do something. In fact, it occurred to me as I was thinking about this presentation, if I were to suddenly say, let's play a game, let's divide up into teams, most of you would find that your attention had suddenly shifted. What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? What are the rules? And that's what games do. They provide a structure that is very powerful and gets you ready for problem solving. That, of course, leads to what Larry was actually talking about, was the power of learning by doing. Games are, in a sense, forms of simulations. Unlike most simulations which deal with simulating physical systems, games really emulate human systems, interactions with the real world, or fantastical imaginary worlds. And in doing all of that, it leads to self-reflection, the kind of thing that really got me to say, I can fly a plane. I can run an imaginary business. So all of that, when done well, leads to sort of a sense of confidence, of empowerment by the player, the student, the user, whatever you'd want to call that, an optimism about what they're capable of accomplishing, and in the really best sense, sort of a sense of wonder. And I'd just like to say, who wouldn't want that in our educational institutions going forward? And so that's why I think there is something to learn from the best creative efforts in the world of games. So in the 80s, of course, there really wasn't much connectivity. But when you think about play and games and playfulness, it's always social. Many of our happiest memories are playing games as a child with family or with friends. And it was really the internet that allowed that sort of primal element of play to be restored, perhaps in unusual aesthetics. And so this is World of Warcraft, what's called a massively multiplayer online game, a term which is actually the direct contributor to the terminology around MOOCs. And what you see here is a group of people among the, at one point, 15 million people playing World of Warcraft around the world. And this is what's called a guild. So what happened was people went online to play, and they quickly learned that they could not be successful in the game unless they formed groups. These groups are called, in some games they're called guilds, in other games they're called clans. And what they really did was illuminate the ability of people to self-organize, to self-govern, and to collaborate. And so in order to succeed, these guilds had to get formed, and they could be hundreds of people, sometimes thousands of people, sometimes run by a 15-year-old, sometimes run by a 30 or 40-year-old. And they would form strategies to beat monsters in the games, or not past tense, they still do. They would assign roles, so everybody had a distinctive role in specific operations and actions. And they would then document what their strategies and what their tactics were so that knowledge could be transmitted to future members of the guilds and the clans. Well, one day in 2002, I think it was, I was speaking to actually US government officials, including some military officials, and I showed them these guild web pages where these people would have extensive discussions about the governance of their organization, about their plans of action. And one US Marine general said, these 15-year-olds show as much capability as the captains, the majors, and the colonels that we have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars per individual to train. He said there must be something about these games, these environments, that is so motivating and provides the structures that lets people learn these vital skills. So that was an interesting piece of feedback that suggested that we were on the right track. In fact, at around that time, researchers in academia, really all over the world, but certainly in the United States, University of Wisconsin in Madison, Arizona State University, and other places, they really sat up and they took notice. And one professor in particular, James G., at that time at the University of Wisconsin, now at Arizona State, wrote this book, and I really recommend it, What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning and Literacy. And Jim really pioneered the field, along with several others, and he argued really that games represented a new form of literacy. Just as we talk about media literacy, digital literacy at large, that games have their own unique language and their own unique meanings. And they are inherently social in the way that many other media are not, because they're experienced in collaborative, very active ways. And he also outlined a series of learning principles that could be found in game design. And I want to use that term very carefully because that's not a term about technology. Technology is an enabler, but it is not the core thing itself in this. And so he said that, one thing that these well-designed games do is they create empowered learners. Learners that can design experiences together or strategize together, that can mod games. There's a whole culture on the internet of taking existing games and opening them up, basically, with various tools and changing them and then redistributing them for others to try. For really exploring your own identity, an inherent part of games is that you take on a persona, which in some of the work we did at Institute of Play allowed you to develop perspective and empathy for other people in the world, or for professions you might want to try on. For problem solving. So games are nothing if not problem solving spaces. You're given a challenge you don't know how to solve. It wouldn't be fun if you did. And you have to figure out how to solve it. And that leads to what I think is one of the most interesting concepts, which is really the idea of just-in-time learning. That you figure out what you need to know just when you need to know it. You don't want to learn something in 6th grade that you're not going to use till you're 25. You're going to forget it. So games create a discipline for designing just-in-time experiences. And finally, games are also systems. And the importance of systems thinking and design thinking in the complexity of the world today is really paramount. It's not enough to know one specific line of facts. You really need to know how the world works as complex systems, whether it's at a macro level or at a micro level. And everyone who plays games explores the boundaries of those systems to figure out how they work. At the same time, I just want to point out that during this period of time, about 10 years ago, games became mainstream. Today, 97% of all kids under 18 play games. The largest single population of game players is actually women in their 30s and 40s, not a fact that's generally known. And also at the same time, because of this research, the world of serious games, games that were used for education, other healthcare, other serious purposes began to emerge. All of that, in turn, led to an interesting initiative in the United States called the Digital Media and Learning Initiative, funded by a foundation, the MacArthur Foundation. And that led to the rise of a number of organizations that really dealt with the learning potential of games and related digital media. And I'm just putting up some of these names here. Most of them did not deal with elementary and secondary school settings, but the Institute-of-Play, where I was, did. And what we really looked at was how do we take the principles of game design and create new institutions and new learning experiences that tap into that power. And the principles that we really created, notice I'm not saying here we have tablets or we have PCs, it's principles of design that matter. That learning should feel like play. That's okay, really, that it feels like that. The challenge is constant, which means that as you become more proficient, the challenges get harder. We've all had that experience in a game. That everything is interconnected, which gets to the systems thinking piece. That feedback's immediate and ongoing. You know, I think next week there's a national test. You take that test here, but you'll wait weeks or months before you know how you did. When you play a game, you know how you're doing. You're either moving forward or you're not. Learning happens by doing. We've covered everyone is a participant, which means not that everybody has the same role, but everyone has a role to play. And that's really important, that learning is collaborative as well as relating to your individual identity. And last, and the hardest for many people to understand, is that failure is reframed as iteration. This generation has grown up playing games they fail 95% of the time when they play. It doesn't depress them. It's not dismaying. It just makes you go back and go, all right, how do I do that better? So to show you some of these principles in action, I have a video. I'm not sure of time here, but I'd like to show it. It's a pretty good illustration that's at the school that we helped design in New York City.
A Rube Goldberg machine is complicated for a simple task.
Boss Level is a week where we work with our home base to complete a project by the end of the week, and we also don't have homework or any other of our usual classes.
If you walk into a Boss Level classroom, you're not seeing really a classroom. All of the desks and tables are pushed aside. You're seeing a lot of materials of all different sorts that are kind of strewn around. You see a lot of sixth graders either tinkering or in a group, brainstorming, possibly sketching. It's a lot of creativity and innovation going on in this space.
We could do like something like this if we had like a hold.
How about this one? They're tiny.
No, we already have a marble. Yeah, they're mixed through here. We are in the market. Wait. Make it look. We don't need it.
My favorite part about Boss Level is the actual building phase. When kids fail during the creation of Rube Goldberg and then they iterate, they are really learning to take risks.
Failure is really bad, but I guess if you have a good attitude, then you can always make it what you wanted it to be and not to get frustrated. So failure is not so bad if you know how to fix it.
Failure, reframed as iteration, means when you fail, just try again.
Students really take a lot of ownership for the machines that they create. Their advisor is in the room, but their advisor really is not helping to do any of the building or even creating. They're really just there as an adult to help facilitate and to make sure that things are going smoothly and safely. So if you walk into a Boss Level classroom, you really see the students as teachers, as learners, as innovators, and they are really helping each other through the iteration process. They are creating this blueprint for their machine in the beginning. They're putting it to the test. They're watching it. They're seeing where the kinks are, where they need to iterate, and they are going through this process really on their own. I think that's also a really great thing about the process, to be able to watch students move through this system on their own and actually succeed at it.
Home base is, I think it might be a little bit like a homeroom.
To be able to see students really incorporate things that they learn in home base and model that during the building is really a great process. One of my home base students, who's in 8th grade now, talks all the time about how he feels that Rube Goldberg was what really brought us together as a home base. So it's a really great moment for us.
Since you have to work together and you spend a lot of time together in a classroom or in a confined space, that you really get to know one another and how one another works.
If you're doing a Rube Goldberg machine, you need to have a lot of teamwork so that one person isn't just working on the front and like a million people are working on the middle. You need to have an even share of everything.
Having gone through the Rube Goldberg process with my own home base, it really proved to be beneficial for many reasons. I mean, not only are they implementing skills that they've learned in the classroom, but as a home base, you really see them bond and really build. You know, they're really kind of stuck in a room for days at a time, and they have to really learn how to get along, how to share ideas, how to respect ideas. Teamwork is probably the most important facet of Rube Goldberg building.
If one person makes one part of the machine and another person makes another part of the machine, if they don't work together, those parts won't work together either, and it probably will not complete its goal.
Great. So, what did we actually just watch? Those kids were assigned a lesson in physics to learn how to make simple machines, pulleys, levers, inclined planes. But what they really learned were a whole set of life skills as 11 and 12-year-olds that you don't often see. So in 1 week, they had to form teams and assign roles. They had to come up with an idea for a room-sized machine. They had to design that machine. They had to find the materials and fabricate it. They had to test it. They had to rehearse their presentation to a group of outside adult judges, and then they had to be assessed in 1 week. It's really a remarkable thing. I don't think most organizations can actually accomplish that, and these are 12-year-olds. So all of that comes from those principles of game-like learning that we talked about, and I suppose a valid question is, how is it working, which happens to be this slide. So there's been some research done on the pedagogical approach here. And I'll just tell you very quickly, the early results show that these kids, when you measure what are called the 21st century skills, strategic thinking, planning and organizing, communicating, they do twice as well in 1 year as an average American college student does in 4. Now, the research is early, but it's very promising. And what we're able to also show is that it's really directly connected to this game-like model of learning that's been developed. So, to go back to a familiar theme from today, you know, all the content in the world fits in your pocket, you know, at amazing rates. And so the delivery of quantities of content is not what is meaningful in education. It's what we do with it and why we seek it out. I also believe that despite, you know, the very important conversation around STEM and around test scores, employers and universities actually are looking for something different. And a survey last year, or the year before, by the National Association of Colleges and Employers in the US revealed these are the 5 things that really they're looking for. People who can plan, prioritize, and organize, who can work in teams, who can communicate effectively, who can make decisions and problem solve, who can obtain and process information. And I don't know any curriculum that's offered in any college that explicitly deals with these things, nor really many faculty members who will take the time to nurture this in their students. And I think it's something we need to really look at and nurture and develop. And these were things that we've discovered over the years are things that well-designed games or experiences that are like games do very well. So just suggesting a way forward here. About technology, by the way, this mass delivery and assessment of content retention is not how you build lifelong learners. It has to really be experiential. We don't want to make the mistake of creating technologies that create greater efficiencies for the things we didn't want to do in the first place. This slide, actually, this image is from 100 years ago, imagining universities in the year 2000. So the question really is, I think there's so much to learn from watching how kids engage with digital media, and particularly with games. It's not us worrying how are they going to learn, but really let's watch how they're learning today in all kinds of different contexts and play along with that. So thank you very much.
Annyeonghaseyo. How's that? Someone should invent a game for us to learn Korean, don't you think? Well, that's not really my slides, but I'll go with it. And I'd love to reserve some time. I know we've got about 40 minutes left, but I'd love to reserve some time for your questions and conversation. What Larry and Robert have presented, really very stimulating in terms of the future of online learning resources and courses and student support and peer learning, all very important. The promise of games and game-like environments for user engagement, for students to learn more, as Robert was saying, earlier than we thought. I began my career at Sesame Workshop in New York, and this is when Robert showed a slide from roughly 1983. This is me in 1982, going back in the time machine 30 years. And one thing I learned at working at Sesame Workshop and working on Sesame Street, which has been called the first MOOC, you know, Friday at 3 o'clock, there would be 5 million American preschoolers watching the same program and learning from that program. Interestingly, the research has shown that there's a certain amount of learning that can happen from watching a television program or perhaps watching a lecture, but it is enhanced based on interactivity between the young preschooler and their parents or their child care provider. That's when the real learning gets reinforced. And what we're trying to find are ways to provide that interactivity between parents, teachers, and learners through digital experiences as well as in-person experiences. So I've traveled in my own learning journey from the longest street in the world to a galaxy long ago and far, far away. Actually, I should, wherever the computer is for the slides, this is a different presentation than the one I sent. So if you could bring up the other one that says Global HR Forum. This is a presentation I gave 2 weeks ago at Big Rock Ranch in California. The presentation I wanted to give is entitled Digital Technology and the Future of Smart Learning, the title of our panel today. So I'll give you a moment if you can find it. It should be somewhere on the laptop. I'm recalling when Robert spoke about seeing middle school students in Honolulu using the Microsoft Flight Simulator just 5 years ago. A total sea change in the quality of the graphics, the quality of the experience. These kids at the ages of 12 and 13 were learning to navigate and fly around the islands of Hawaii. I've seen students in that age group in middle schools also able to take flying lessons using the flight simulator from Tuskegee Airmen. Tuskegee Airmen were a very brave group of fighter pilots during World War II, African Americans. There's been several films made about them, but imagine being able to learn to fly an airplane using a flight simulator from an African American fighter pilot. They had their own group of fighter pilots because they were not allowed to be in an integrated fighter pilot group, so they were African Americans who flew pilots and were very decorated as some of the bravest pilots. I'll just keep going unless you find some other slides. I guess you're looking back there. Okay, good. I'll just keep going. What I was going to talk more about in my presentation is this idea of smart learning. The word smart is a great word, but we shouldn't equate it with quick learning or learning more content, more knowledge. What I mean by smart learning is this shift, as has been suggested by the two speakers, to really engage young people more deeply in their learning. And that means more than just looking at screens and absorbing content. It means trying to really understand your strengths as a learner, the importance of interacting with different groups of learners, the importance of mentors and adults who can help guide the way, the shift of teachers from presenting information. The flipped classroom is something that's become very popular in the States, where teachers, in high school especially, are putting their lectures online, and that's the homework. So instead of coming to class and having the teacher talk to you for 45 minutes, you watch the teacher talk in a lecture as homework, and then you come and ask questions. There's been some very interesting research about the importance of interrupting the lecture, to have students share their understanding, their misunderstanding, what they know and what they don't understand, and through peer learning, they're able to progress much faster. So my plea to you today is to consider ways in which the learning can become much more engaging, much more personalized. Perhaps we need to think about not just learning anytime, any place, but what about learning any path, any pace? That's what technology can now provide. Again, Robert's example of being interested in using a flight simulator, being interested in flight navigation, that's usually not part of the high school curriculum. Imagine if a student was interested in that today. You could find ways to bring that into the curriculum for a student had that interest and have them experience that through digital technology and through the simulation of a flight simulator. George Lucas himself was someone who did not do well in school. He started our foundation, the George Lucas Educational Foundation, to really help the millions of students out there who are sitting in the back of class, not very engaged, probably getting a C and maybe a D. That was Mr. Lucas in high school. If you had asked him, George, imagine, it's kind of an interesting thought. Imagine you've got George Lucas sitting in the back of your high school classroom and you're the teacher. You know who he is today in his career, but imagine that you had a student like that who wasn't raising his hand, not participating much, getting a C or a D. If you'd asked him, George, it's almost time to graduate high school, and what do you want to do? What are you interested in? He would have said, I'm interested in cars, and I'm interested in photography. Back in those days, cars and photography, again, were not part of the curriculum, but again today, if that student in the back of your class, and I have these interests, you could find ways through digital learning resources and through this marvelous internet to bring that student into deeper learning. As Mr. Lucas said in interviews, I wasn't just interested in automobile engineering, I was interested in everything about cars, the history of the automobile, the design of the automobile, its engineering, the business of automobiles. So again, you could come very close to what we now call project-based learning through the potential of the internet. Looking one eye on the clock, I won't say much about my own personal journey aside from the fact that my parents came from China to the United States. After the Communist Revolution in '49, they could not go home again. So I was very fortunate to be raised in the United States, to get a good education, to have a great career. But in this last decade of my own career, I'm trying to do more to encourage more U.S.-Asia understanding. I do believe that as Asia goes in the future, it will have a tremendous impact on the entire world. The U.S. and Asia need to become better partners in this. I'm glad that we have a number of Americans represented at this conference. We need to work more closely together. I think if Asia and the U.S. find a way to work together in partnership, create more global prosperity, as the HR Forum often says, that can assure a better future for all of us and for the entire world, really. Our Edutopia website is the solution to George's answer, what can I do to help education? So this website was created about 15 years ago. working for a filmmaker. We have a number of documentary films, Robert just showed you one of them, that really show what it looks like in the classroom. You know, in education, we often talk about very high-minded, abstract concepts. Educators told Mr. Lucas, if you could just make a film about that classroom, about project-based learning, when students are trying to create a Rube Goldberg invention, then that would help us a lot. Mr. Lucas said, I understand that. He said, you know, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I said, George, that's why you're George Lucas. I wish I had thought of that. On our website, we've got a lot of content about globalizing the curriculum. We're trying to raise, in the United States and really around the world, global learners. I'm glad that's been such an important theme of this conference. So you'll see a lot of examples on our website about ways in which students, from the very youngest students, 5-year-olds through high school students, can get engaged with global curriculum. I wrote a book based on our work. It's translated in Korean, as President Hwang said. I talked about 6 leading edges of innovation in our schools, things like project-based learning, which are at the edge of the educational system, moving towards the center. I'll talk some more about this in my talk tomorrow. I think it's now possible, as we've been saying, to talk about weapons of mass instruction. We now have these powerful devices at an affordable cost. They fit in your pocket or your purse. Let's try to make sure that every student, not just in Korea, not just in the United States, but everywhere around the world, has access to these powerful digital devices. To me, it's become, in the US, the civil rights issue of our time to ensure that students from low-income backgrounds who don't go to very good schools have this access. The UN would say that this is now a human rights issue, that education is the key to the development goals of the world, and that we need to provide these very powerful devices to every student around the world. Propose to you that maybe education is becoming YOU at the center of your own education. That we need to tell learners around the world, especially young students, that they're now in charge of their learning, that they can be at the center of their own learning. So thank you very much.